Welcome, everybody, to the next edition of Corporate Impact Leaders, CSR Talent Group's podcast. Today, we are so pleased to have Mel Niepold with us. She is the founder and president of the Mara Partners. And I will ask Mel to explain who she is and what she does.
Great. Tom, it's good to be with you. I mean, we go way back into the early days of the then CSR movement and then the ESG movement. And here we find ourselves today in a whole new world. And we'll talk more about that. But basically, in a nutshell, I am a global human rights and climate expert with a particular emphasis on gender and the way all of that intersects with climate change. And I do that work through a combination of research, training, and writing. And I do it with civil society partners, Fortune 500 companies, small companies as well, and governments. So I'm really happy to have this conversation.
I didn't prepare you for this, but can you tell us about one of the more interesting projects you've had in your past, just to give us a little more context in your background?
Sure, absolutely. I think a project that comes to mind only because it is one of the most recent, but also in a way a culmination of some of my longest held beliefs about why women's empowerment and even girls' empowerment and girls' education, which we'll get into because there's a lot of research on that, why that matters to climate, and obviously why climate matters to women and girls.
Mm.
We hear a lot about because, oh, they're more impacted and it's negative and more women die in climate disasters, which is true. I don't want to talk about that. That's what I call the victim lens. What I talk about is the reverse. What is that solution space that women and girls bring to the table? And the project I want to mention is a more recent one that happened several months ago. And there had been a curriculum based on the Harvard Business School negotiation curriculum that one of its professors, Kathleen McGinn, who has subsequently retired, Kathleen created a modified version of the vaunted Harvard negotiation curriculum to be used with adolescent girls, teaching them negotiation skills as a way for them to have safer sex. That was the design of the program. But what's so exciting about this work that was done in Zambia, and why I then picked the ball up and ran with it most recently with older women, was the following. The women got negotiations, the girls, excuse me, originally the girls who were 12 to 14 got negotiation skills and they used it to advocate. Not, safe sex was kind of not their focus, which I love that story. Their focus was that getting their school fees paid.
Hmm.
I think bravo. Got their school fees paid, but what we know about climate and girls being in school is that that reduces CO2 emissions because educated girls end up having, by choice, fewer children.
Hmm.
That part of the story, so far, so good. But I took the curriculum with Kathleen's partnership and brought it to Zimbabwe to train women at the front lines of climate change who were fighting things like poaching and other activities in the front lines of the fight to prevent things like deforestation. And we took the negotiation curriculum to them. And what happened all over again? Oh, I'm going to use this to start a business. I'm going to use this to advocate for a raise. I'm going to use this to negotiate with poachers. But what matters in the story is that the negotiation tactic allows women to fight climate change on behalf of all of us in a handful of different ways. So we'll talk about more what the ways are, but it ends up being a layer cake of solutions.
That's so interesting. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
So, for those of us and those listening who may not have your depth of knowledge and experience around gender and climate, can you tell us a little bit about the history and how
Mhm.
you've seen it evolve, as well as the connection? You gave us a taste there
Mhm.
of how important women and girls are relating to climate. But tell us a
Mhm.
little bit more about the importance of women and the relationship with climate, if you could.
Yeah. So again, a minute ago I mentioned the rainbow. I often refer to it as a rainbow cake because I actually found a photograph of, I think, a Betty Crocker cake that had colors not found in food.
Hmm.
And it was like this bright purple layer, orange, red, green, yellow. Again, did not look edible, but boy, does it make a great point. And what I always say is whether women and girls are empowered through negotiation or through going to school or through better livelihoods, The starting point doesn't matter. What ends up happening is that the impacts fan out, which is where I call the layer cake. The impacts fan out in any number of ways, and I'll just give you a few of my favorites. The research done by Thomas Malone at MIT is a little bit older. It was research that was done in 2011, but it still holds true today. And it also held true back in the Heady, Watson days of IBM. IBM believed that diversity made for better cars, excuse me, better computers. I'm thinking of Ford also, but the point is that having more women around a table solving a problem, working as a team, has been shown to make the team's performance better, more innovative, better governance. Thomas Malone and his partners talk about the way that having more women in a negotiation or in a discussion around product design, let's say, makes the team more innovative, and they call it collective intelligence, and the collective intelligence of the team goes up. So we'll hold that one idea.
Yeah.
More women at the table, better innovation. We also see that when women are empowered economically, typically a fraction of them will go on to run for office, and a fraction of them will win, and they will then pass better environmental legislation. So you have gains there. There are others around governance, reduced corruption, you name it. But the innovation one is the one I love the most because in a currently politicized climate, what we can all agree on, no matter what our political backgrounds, no matter any of our perspectives, which country we come from, I've never met a company that didn't believe innovation was important.
I want to ask you about the policy piece there, because you mentioned that women that get elected
Mhm.
um, tend to enact more environmentally friendly policies.
Yep.
And that's part of the research is that women tend to be more in tune with the environment, more sensitive or more appreciative of the power of the environment for their well-being. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yes. So, as we said earlier, women do, when they're in office, and there's an enormous amount of research on this, they do tend to pass better environmental laws and be an advocate for men and women in a parliament to
Mm.
pass better environmental laws. It tends to be thought of as they're doing it to protect themselves and their children from the higher death rate. So women and children after extreme weather events, much higher mortality than men.
Right.
So you could say, oh, they're doing it to essentially save their lives. But actually, the good news is we don't have to be reductionist. It's not just to save their lives,
Mm.
it's actually to save everyone's lives. And what the research shows is that women have that longer term thinking and what I said earlier about collective intelligence. Women will say, well, wait, if we cut down our entire rainforest here in our community, let's say in West Africa, where I've worked a lot, when that forest cover is gone and the wood is gone and you've sold the trees, we have nothing.
Mm.
And it's that difference between short-term cash crops and long-term, what about this? What about that? What in negotiation theory we call what if thinking.
Mhm.
Women are very, very good at that sort of what if thinking. So
Mm.
that's just one example.
That's very interesting. Well, part of the goal of these podcasts is to give the corporate folks that are listening in some ideas about
Mhm.
what they can do, what they should do, what they need to do, what's possible. And obviously, during this time when there's so many attacks on so many different things, especially around DEI in the United States, I'm curious about your thoughts about what's happening globally. I know a lot of your work is international.
Mhm.
Um, we are mostly talking to U.S. companies now, many of whom most likely work globally in international locations. Tell us what you're seeing as far as both the USAID cuts and the attack on DEI, and how companies are reacting, and whether that's what kind of impact that's having on some of the work you've been doing and some of the
Mhm.
work that you're hoping should be done internationally in this area.
Right. Well, that's an excellent question because we are really living in in sort of I could say multi-tiered kind of global environment, but I really think it's a two-tiered one. It's what's happening in the United States because of our outsized footprint and the number of corporations that work around the world that are American, so domiciled here in the United States, but that have manufacturing
Sure.
overseas. I mean, we see it with what's going on with tariffs, what companies like Apple and others are doing. So we have this bifurcation because in the United States, the government currently is running as far as it can back into the 1950s or worse. 19, well, if we take away the right for women to vote, we're running back into the 1900s, early 1900s. And I don't say that lightly. Really, what we see is that the European Union is by and large pushing ahead with very robust human rights due diligence legislation, legislation around deforestation, and so on and so forth. So if you start with legislation, the United States currently is completely out of sync with many of the other global economies. The Chinese, for example, they are leading in renewable energy. They lead in all kinds of other areas. So if the EU is doing it and China's doing it, and you've got, I won't speak about India, I know it less well, and I also know that they're a little bit behind on some of their legislation. But major global trading partners understand that extreme weather is hurting the profits of corporations. They understand further that insurance companies have raised premiums astronomically. So even if tariffs weren't happening, what we see is insurance rates for companies are rising, costs for shipping, all the things. So costs are rising. So companies that are in the United States, literally, as the French have a great expression, which is you can't sit down comfortably if you're between two chairs. And I feel that that is exactly what's happening for the US companies. So you could say, well, they're going to be busy focused on legislation. What do I do in the EU? What do I do here? But there's a meta level that I think is even more interesting, which is the companies that have been on this journey for sustainability and ESG, and even back when it was called CSR, Tom, and you and I first met in the beginnings of our career, it doesn't matter what you call it. Many, many, many companies, not just leading companies, many companies now understand that diversity, equity, and inclusion, and you could literally just call it, I frequently just think of it as equity because equity it automatically means it's diverse and inclusive.
Mhm.
But the point being, diversity is good for business. It makes, as I just said earlier, it makes for better innovation gains. It makes a company more adept at understanding their market share. It makes them better at anticipating the desires of consumers like women and youth, and so on and so on. So the bottom line benefits to companies haven't changed. So what I think I'm seeing, and I certainly can anticipate because obviously the cuts have hit me personally, so I'm not quite as busy as I used to be. So my finger isn't quite as much on the pulse as it was, say, 6 months ago. But what I know to be true is that the leading companies know that climate change is real. They know it hurts their products, and they know that diversity, equity, and inclusion makes them a better company. So I think if we want to convert that reality into a tip, which I'm sure many of them have already thought of, it's not rocket science, but it's subtle. If in America you can't say DEI and you can't perhaps have a foundation that focuses on it, and you can't use words like DEI, and you can't, some people are trying to say we can't use words like gender equity. I don't know anyone who saw the list in the New York Times. I mean, literally the entire list was everything I've ever worked on. Gender, diversity, equity, climate change, you name it. But what I say to companies is the following if you know it's good for your company, and let's not forget your workforce, and it makes you a competitive, modern employer that people want to work for, then do it. And if you have to call it something else for 4 years. Just go ahead, call it innovation gain. It
Sure.
doesn't matter what we call it, it matters that we do it.
So just stepping back a little bit for companies that, and we talk to all types of companies, all sizes, growing companies, new companies that may be doing working internationally just in the last couple of years and are trying to find their way, versus some of the larger companies that have been in some of the locations you've mentioned for
Mhm.
decades, if not longer. Um, just stepping back for a second and helping them think about how to get started. Um, is there, and you probably do this, and this is a chance for you to talk a little bit about the kinds of services you provide.
Mhm.
Um, do you go into a company, especially those newer companies, and just help them understand the landscape, what others are doing, programs that you've worked on that have had some success, but more importantly, the baby steps, the first couple steps they
Mm.
need to take to get started? And how would you approach a new company's desire to learn more about this and to get moving on it in a way that's, not going to be too overwhelming, especially given this climate?
No, first of all, anything that's about baby steps and simplicity, I'm a huge fan. So I really appreciate the question because this shouldn't be complex.
Right.
It got complex because of regulation. It got complex because of legal frameworks. It got complex because of politics. However, if we go down to the most basic thing, my company was founded in 2011. Very, very quickly, certainly by the time Hillary Clinton ran for president, the work and the research on climate change and its impact on business had gone just through the roof. And so in 2016, and especially with the way that election went, my company, we pivoted to an integrated way of looking at gender or women's empowerment. Some companies call it that. An integrated way of looking at climate or environmental, each company's different, climate, environment, and gender in an integrated way. And what that means specifically is that when you're a big company, you may, in fact, have an entire environmental team, and
Mhm.
you may also have an entire gender equity team or a women's empowerment team. You may also be so big that you have a foundation, like L'Oreal, one of the companies I most admire that works at the intersection of gender and climate. They have a foundation that's doing amazing work. So you've got huge teams in three different areas. But for a small company, excuse me, the first baby step that I really focus on is not having two different teams. I actually strongly encourage people to approach human rights, compliance, and climate and any of your other commitments holistically and together. So, what does that mean for a small company? It actually means perhaps a lower headcount, which can be very important to a small company. It doesn't have to be an expensive undertaking, but it has to be a mindset. And this is a good opportunity to whip out my favorite intersectional thinking tool. This is the pink and green lens that I use with companies, to say basically, do your work on women and women's empowerment and girls at the same time as you work on the environment and vice versa. And what that would mean specifically, and I'll give you a real example. Companies, a food company, let's say, that is losing crops due to extreme drought, they may be, and many of them are, putting in things like shade trees that protect the crop from drought. So far, so good. But what they're also doing is they're using women who are underemployed to be the ones to raise the shade trees that are then used on the farms that the men run to protect the crop. Therefore, women have livelihoods and the crop is protected. You
Interesting.
have two things happening at the same time. And that's what I recommend as the very first step to companies of any size is to think of it intersectionally.
That's so interesting. I've heard a similar example on the healthcare side.
Mm,
Underutilized women who were serving as community connectors around health issues,
mm.
villages where it was very difficult to get healthcare. Um, well, that's fascinating, and we could talk about this for another 10 hours, I think. And there's so
At
many
least.
issues that could be addressed, but I would encourage people listening to come find you through us or you directly. And but I'd like to leave them with just a few final thoughts. Anything we haven't touched on that you'd like to make sure people understand about the work that you're doing, or or some of the issues that you think are most important for companies to be thinking about right now, especially when it comes to the intersection of gender and climate?
Right. Well, I think right now there are a few things because how I would answer that question 6 months ago would have been different.
Yeah.
It would have been keep going, follow your nose. The research is there, research from McKinsey, the World Bank, EY, academic institutions. The research, the incredible research done. Bentley University did research on the positive impacts of women on boards.
Mm.
I could take up the next 10 hours you just mentioned just by citing research.
Yeah.
So let's start with this. The scientific basis, the evidence base for why women and girls matter to climate is incredibly well established.
Mhm.
However, my experience over 20 years isn't, you know what? The research may say whatever you want. That's not what gets people motivated. So, what I think is critical right now, because we are in a uniquely adverse climate, bad choice of words, we are in a terribly adverse time
Mhm.
to be working on climate change. The US has rolled back all the major commitments that matter. Globally, if China, India, and the EU do the right thing, is it enough to offset us doing the wrong thing? I'm not sure. I'm not a climate scientist. But what I will say that is very important is that right now is all hands on deck. We cannot let rollbacks in the United States get in the way of progress. And the way any company can help is by doing the right thing, by including women. If they're in a field where advancing the rights of girls is their focus, that's great. Not all companies are. But for those, if we stay just with women, the simplest way I can explain it is that if you walk into a boardroom or if you walk into a product design meeting, if you walk into a procurement meeting, an environmental assessment, a siting visit, factory inspection, and you don't see women. And I don't mean women taking notes. I'm always very clear about
Yeah.
this. I don't mean women who are there by quota. I mean women who are influencing the decision making.
Mhm.
The very basic step is noticing. If those women are not present, or if they're present and being ignored,
Mhm.
because women in the room is only half the story.
Yeah.
If their voices are ignored, then you will fail as a company. You will not be cutting edge. You will not be innovative. The research speaks loudly to that. And the last thing I'll say is that when companies of any size do the right thing and include the voices of the women, the spillover benefits have multiple, go back to the layer cake. More women in a workforce means that they will invest more money in educating their children, including their girl children. So clearly, what you see is that all roads lead to Rome. And my favorite tool of all is women who are empowered at work. And that, because they're all the things I just said about income and all the things, women with livelihoods are a key strategy in climate change.
So
So
interesting.
these companies have the power, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I lied. I do have one more question. And
Oh, you're fine.
you mentioned L'Oreal as
Yes,
one of the better companies. Um, are you comfortable mentioning some other companies that you
sure.
think are doing well in this space and have committed
Absolutely.
to this?
Yeah. Each company is doing things in different ways. The few that I'll mention right now do tend to be on the larger side,
Mhm.
but again, it's worth noting because that means that anyone can learn from them. One of the other ones that I am, and over the years have advised them. There are two others in the food space. One is Nestle, and the one I know they've got people have issues with Nestle for historical problems. I'm not talking about that. I am not talking about baby formula.
Sure.
I am, however, talking about they have a program called the Income Accelerator Program, and it has done from the get-go. They built gender equity into it from the get-go, and they said 50% of the premiums that we pay to farmers for all the various activities, 50% will not just go to the husband and say, please give this to your wife, or please invest this in whatever. No, no. they took extra strides to ensure that the women received the money directly.
Wow.
And that has been a very hard project. The other one is Mondelez because they are the ones who did the Shade Tree Nursery program I mentioned. So we've mentioned three, and they're all very large.
Yeah,
But I have seen progress in smaller companies as well.
great.
And the mindset is what matters, not the size.
Well, Mill, this was fascinating. And again, we could go on forever, but I encourage folks to reach out to us and we can connect you with Mill. And perhaps we'll talk about maybe putting some of that research up on our site so people can access it.
Yeah,
Makes sense.
that
But
sounds great.
yeah, again, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us for this podcast. And please feel free to reach out to me and Nil if you have any questions. And we will talk again soon. Take care, everybody.
Thanks for the opportunity.
You're welcome.